This is lab 1, introduction and setup. And the labs that we're going to be doing are going to basically, we're going to incrementally develop a complete deep learning code base for a single purpose, understanding the content of handwritten paragraphs. And you saw a slide from Josh in the intro lecture that kind of alluded to this. So the key I want to focus on is incremental develop, right? So lab 1 is going to be the least amount of code that we'll see. And then lab 2 is going to build on top of it and add code. And we're always going to be adding more code with each lab. And there's 10 labs total. We're going to be using the currently best framework, which is PyTorch, and PyTorch Lightning being a training kind of harness around PyTorch, which implements a lot of nice stuff and is in active development. We're going to use the best methods, which are CNNs, RNNs, and transformers. We're going to use what we believe to be the best experiment management system, which is weights and biases, and what we believe to be the best way to deploy on the web, which is package it up as a Docker container and then use a serverless AWS Lambda function, which now supports containers. It's a game changer to deploy it as a REST API on the web. And then we're going to look at the best way to monitor the model in production. In more detail, today we're going to do the introduction, we're going to formulate the problem, we're going to look at the structure of our code base, and then we're simply going to train an MLP on MNIST. Next week, we're going to introduce CNNs, and we're going to introduce a new data set called eMNIST, extended MNIST, which contains letters as well as digits. We're going to generate synthetic handwritten lines using that data set, and we're going to train CNNs for the purpose of recognizing characters, but also entire lines. Lab 3, we're going to use RNNs. We're going to use CNN and an LSTM on top of it with CTC loss, which is crucial for sequence models of this type to recognize text in a line of handwriting. In lab 4, we're going to do the same thing, except now using transformers. So it's a different approach. We're not using LSTM with CTC, we're using CNN on transformers now. In lab 5, we're going to look at some real handwriting data and then use weights and biases for running a lot of experiments. Lab 6, we're going to either detect lines, so like given a whole page of text, can we find lines of text? Or we'll actually implement a whole paragraph recognition. See how that goes. Lab 7, we'll do some data management. We'll label our own handwriting data. We'll, discuss how to properly store it, be able to train on it. Lab 8, we're going to introduce continuous integration. We're going to introduce continuous linting and testing of our code. Lab 9, we will do deployment, once again to the web. We're going to run it first locally as a REST API using Fast API, then still locally but in a Docker container, and then finally we're going to put that container in production using AWS Lambda. Lab 10, we're going to set up monitoring that should alert us when the incoming data distribution or our prediction distribution changes. Today, we're going to talk about the problem and the code base. So the goals today, understand the problem, our kind of, formulated path to solution, set up our computing environment, and then review the code base that we have so far, and then use it to train on MNIST, just the kind of hello world of deep learning. So we want to be able to have some kind of service that I guess Josh at some point called Text Recognizer Pro, that we can take an image of a handwritten paragraph of text and somehow obtain a transcription of it automatically. And the way we're going to implement it is by sending the image, from a phone or a computer off to a web backend, which is going to run our prediction model. And the prediction model is going to be trained via the process of model training. So even more specifically, we're going to make a post request, right? Like REST API, right? Get, post, delete, stuff like that. we're going to make a request with the image encoded or the image URL. We're going to load the image, detect lines in it, pass each line through some kind of model that's going to take a line and output text, encode the response of this whole system. That's the prediction, full stack deep learning, whatever, have some kind of confidence on it. And then we can respond to the caller with that prediction. And in order to compile this prediction model, we of course need data, right? So we need text, pages of text, images of lines of text, labels of lines of text. What does this line actually say? We need training code, and we need to combine everything to find and save the weights that give good results. So the next thing we're going to do is set up our computing environment. So I actually recorded a setup video, which you can watch, whenever. I can also do it live right now. So let's do it. So I already shared, all these slides on the website. So when you download the slides, you'll be able to click on the link, and the link will take you to our repo, and specifically the setup README. Okay. So there's kind of two ways that we can run labs in this course. If you have access to a computer that has GPUs or TPUs, and runs Linux, then you're welcome to set it up yourself. And there's a really nice system to set it up. I'm not going to talk about it today. What I am going to talk about it is for the people who don't have access to a computer with a GPU, you can actually use Google Colab, the same thing we were using for the notebook. So let's go through that. We'll go to Colab, and all you need is a Google account. Your Berkeley account's a Google account, so you can use that. You'll see a screen like this. You'll click New Notebook. You will connect to a GPU runtime. So change runtime type, GPU, save. Connect. Okay, I'm in business. Let's make sure we have GPUs. Nice. So this time we have a P100, not as nice as a V100, but still a lot nicer than a K80. If you get a K80, that's fine too, but it's not as good. And then the next thing we're going to do is do a little bit of setup, So we're going to clone the repository into Colab. We're going to CD into that directory. We're going to install the only missing dependency, which is PyTorch Lightning. Everything else Colab provides for us. And we're going to just set Python path environment variable to dot, which means current directory. It's just something that's going to make things a lot nicer for us. So here we are, we're cloning, installing PyTorch Lightning. And when this thing stops spinning, we know we're done. Okay, so it stopped spinning, so we are done. Okay, great, but it'd be nice to see code, So what we can do is we can click right here on Files, and we can see that we checked, this is the repo we checked out. Same thing that we were seeing, well, I guess we haven't seen it yet, but it's what you can see in the GitHub. It's the same file structure that we now have in Colab. And just to test it out, we're still doing setup, but just to test it out, let's go into lab 1, which we can do with this CD magic. So if something starts with a bang or an exclamation mark, that's like a hardcore shell command, But for some things that are also shell commands, there's a nice, what's known as an IPython magic, which starts with a %sign. And it's just kind of like IPython making it a little nicer to do that thing, which could be done as a shell command. So we've changed directories into lab 1. And now just to test that things work, we can run in the shell Python training, run experiment. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in the days to come, but we'll just say max epochs equals 3. Yeah, let's just run that and see what happens. Okay, so it looks like it's downloading MNIST from Jan LeCun's website. It's always fun. It's storing it here into data/downloaded/MNIST, just in case you're curious. And then we also have some other data files in here, which will come in useful in the future labs. For now, just kind of don't worry about that. We have a makefile, environment YAML, and requirements. That'll be very useful to those of you who are setting it up on your own machine, but it's not useful in Colab, so we can just ignore it for now. And what we have is lab 1, this directory. And that's kind of where we are right now. So what it's doing is it's training right now. And a question we might have is it using GPU? We can answer that by pressing this terminal at the bottom here. And what do you know? We get a terminal. And we can do that same trick that we did before. Let's just give it a little more room. And it doesn't look like it's using the GPU. There's no running process. There's no utilization. And that's totally fine because we didn't actually expect it to use GPU. This is training a multi-layer perceptron, just like we coded up on MNIST. So it's not a big problem. It's not a big data set. It's not a big model. It actually can be done on the CPU pretty efficiently. But if we want to train it using GPUs, let's still only go for 3 epochs. But now we can say GPUs equals, and we can say -1 to use all available GPUs on the machine. And here it's just one machine or one GPU. So let's go ahead and run that. Fold this out a little bit so we can see. So now we're seeing utilization. So it actually is using the GPU. It's using it very inefficiently because it's such a small model and small batch size. But we just want to see that it's using it, and it is. So that's perfect. Let's close this for a second. And let's go ahead and look at, actually, before we start looking at the code structure, let's review the code base, what little of it we have right now, and then train on MNIST, which we kind of already did. So once again, I have the README. I also recorded the video walkthrough in the past, so you can see it in the future also. But I'll do it live right now. And I'll actually, instead of using Colab at this time, I'm going to switch to Visual Studio Code. Okay, and this is like for those of you who might be setting your own machine up, or in fact, there's a crazy thing that you can do if you feel like it. If you go to Setup, README, there's actually a way to run VS Code on Colab, and all it takes is just this much code. So you just run that in the cell, and you can get a VS Code browser tab, not as good as the real thing, but it's connected to Colab. So for those of you who really like VS Code, you can do that. But I really like VS Code, but only if it's on my own machine. All right, and I happen to have a machine here with 2 GPUs, and I've checked out the same repo that you guys have checked out on Colab. It's the exact same thing. I just want to use VS Code because it's a little nicer if we're kind of going through stuff and clicking around. So what is the structure of our project? So at the top level, we have makefile, environment YAML, requirements. These are things you can read about. I'm not going to cover them right now. They're super useful, but right now I want to talk about specifically the kind of Python code that we're going to be writing. So like I said, we're building incrementally, right? So everything in lab 1 is also going to be there in lab 2. So next week I'll release lab 2. You'll see another folder called lab 2. It'll have all of this stuff plus some extra stuff. So this is really the least amount of code that we'll ever see, right? And it's divided into two parts, text recognizer and training. Text recognizer is the Python kind of package, right, that we are developing. We're developing something that can take an image of text and output transcription of text. That's what we're developing. Part of that code that we're developing is actually going to be learned, right? Part of it is going to be written as Python code by us. Part of it is going to be learned as a bunch of 32-bit floats by PyTorch via the process of training, right? And so training is all the code that we are writing to facilitate that process, right? So training versus text recognizer. Right now, training doesn't have much. It just has this init file, which is empty because it's a Python packaging convention to have this init file. And then it has this script called runExperiment.py, which is less than 100 lines of code. But in those less than 100 lines, we're able to take a bunch of command line parameters, basically specify the model class, the data class, so MLP for us, MNIST for us today, specify any number of PyTorch Lightning trainer arguments, like which GPUs we should use, how many workers we should use for prefetching data, how many epochs we want to train for, and also any of the parameters that MLP or MNIST define themselves. And so let's look at that. So there's not that much code. You can read through it later. Let's switch into what's actually inside of text recognizer. So inside of text recognizer, we have this empty init, no big deal. Some utility functions like read image that are useful to like a lot of things. And then three main subdirectories, data, models, and lit models, okay? Data is all the code that we need to interface with data. So today we're using MNIST. So let's open up MNIST. MNIST data module, right, inherits from base data module. And one thing that's nice in VS Code is I can right click go to definition, and it highlights the file that it's in. So it's in base data module.py in this directory. Base data module inherits from PyTorch Lightning data module. And so this is the interface that PyTorch Lightning basically has for presenting data to the training system, right? So what it's responsible for is downloading the data, right? So somewhere you might have to download data, you might have to just like copy it from some other directory, processing data, which is done in setup. So there we maybe your data might be downloaded as float 64s, but you want it to be 16-bit floats or something. So that would be the place to do it. And split it into train, validation, and test splits. I'm going to close this for a second so you can see the code a little better. So specifically for MNIST, we're actually going to use like a Torch provided MNIST instead of downloading it ourselves. You still need to download it. So in prepare data, we download it, both the train and the test splits. In setup, we furthermore split the train into train and val, right? And we apply transforms, which we define right here. And so transforms are something from Torch Vision, which is going to be useful, that basically converts images to tensors and then further normalizes the tensors so that it's kind of nice and easy to learn on. Data modules are also responsible for saying what input dimensions they provide and what output dimensions they provide. And then another thing that we want to cover is this base data module. So it adds a couple of arguments like batch size and num workers. So these arguments are going to be exposed through that run experiment py script. So if you want to add some other argument, like subsample fraction, you can do that here and then use this via this args parameter. You can use now subsample fraction for whatever you want in your code. So that's a quite nice system. And lastly, there's this concept of, so these are called data modules, and there's another word which is data loaders, and then there's another word which is data sets. And PyTorch and PyTorch Lightning kind of use these three words. I explain exactly what they are and what they mean in the README of Lab 1. So I'm not going to do it right now, but you should read through it and kind of make sure you understand it. So that's data, right? Models are things that are basically neural networks. Like you could call them networks, right? But model is a common word for them. Torch, we inherit from torch.nn.module, right? So that could be another word for it. But basically it's something that is part code, part learned weights, that takes data and outputs other data. That's all a model is. This particular one is an MLP, Multilayer Perceptron, same ones that we saw in the lecture. This one has, I guess, 3 layers. One of them takes input dimension to the first hidden dimension. Another one takes first hidden dimension to second hidden dimension. And then lastly, hidden dimension number 2 to the final output, which is number of classes. All it does is like whatever input comes in, it flattens it into just one vector, applies the first, linear layer to it, applies nonlinearity, applies dropout, second linear layer, nonlinearity dropout, third linear layer, and that's it. And the hidden layer dimensionality we can set on the command line via these 2 arguments. So that is all that an MLP model is. And lastly, there's lit models, right? So someone asked, why do we use PyTorch Lightning? So the answer is because PyTorch doesn't come with a training loop, right? You remember we had to code up our own fit method in the notebook that basically took our model, took a learning rate, took an optimizer, took a loss function. And so you need to keep track of all these things, right? Like they need to live in some place. And PyTorch Lightning has a very good framework, I guess, for where to put these things. And the way it works, right, is we have this base lit model. So that's the one we're going to use for a lot of things. You instantiate it with a model. So you instantiate it with, for example, MLP. And then it instantiates its own optimizer with a learning rate and its loss function. And then it instantiates any number of metrics that it may want to care about, like train accuracy, validation accuracy, test accuracy. We can set the optimizer on the command line. We can set the learning rate on the command line. We can set the loss function on the command line. And then basically if we implement this training step, validation step, and test step, we can use this model in the PyTorch Lightning training harness, and it'll work on CPU exactly the same as on GPU. So PyTorch Lightning will take care of making sure the tensors end up on in the right place. We can distribute the training of this model over multiple GPUs. So we can do data parallel training basically effortlessly. I'll show you in a second on my computer. And so this is why we use PyTorch Lightning. Like we just follow this framework, and then there's a lot of nice things that are enabled for us. Okay, so by the way, the training step is, our batch is X and Y. We're going to run X through ourselves by using the forward method, which is actually just going to run it through the model that we were instantiated with. That generates log probabilities. We compute the loss function between log probabilities and the true labels. We log the loss. We log the train accuracy. And that's about it. And the validation, we do the same, except with validation loss and validation accuracy. So now let's actually use it. right? So I'm opening up terminal. I'm in lab 1, and I'm doing Python training, run experiment.py. Data class equals MNIST. Model class equals MLP. Max number of epochs is going to be, let's just run it for like, I don't know, 5. FC1, so the dimensionality of our FC, the first hidden layer, let's just say 128. FC2, let's just say it's bigger, 256. Batch size, 32. And we don't have to set all of these because there's always nice defaults for them, right? So for example, in our base data module, batch size, that's where that flag was added. And the default is batch size, which is 128. So that's probably fine. But if we want to overwrite it, we can. Let's just overwrite FC1 and FC2. And lastly, let's use GPUs. And let's actually use 0 and 1, right? So we're going to use both of these GPUs. Well, actually, let's just start with just one of them. So let's use GPU 0. So it is training. It looks like it's training pretty fast. We can go into another terminal and do watch-n1 NVIDIA-SMI. This watch-n1 just means refresh the output of this command every second. And we see that the GPU is being used. Once again, not efficiently at all, but that's what we got. PyTorch Lightning is nicely printing the loss, the validation loss, if we give it a little more room, the validation accuracy. At the end of training, it tests, it shows you the accuracy. So that's pretty good, 96.7% accuracy, right? Now let's train on 2 GPUs at once. I have 2 GPUs, let's use both of them. So here we want to also add this accelerator equals DDP. Did I misspell accelerator? It's kind of embarrassing. So here we're actually going to use both GPUs that I have. And PyTorch Lightning takes care of distributing the data onto both of them. So now we see that both GPUs are being used. It's actually also running TensorBoard behind the scenes. I'm not sure that I have the port. Yeah, it's not going to work right now. But basically, I could open up TensorBoard, which PyTorch Lightning is automatically running for this. And you can see that it finished training faster than before because it's using 2 GPUs. So that is basically it. That's the structure of Lab 1. Part of the weekly assignment is going to be to just play around with it, make sure you can train, and maybe try different settings of FC1, FC2. Try messing with this. Like, see what happens if you delete dropout or add more layers or whatever you want to do. Modularize this so you can actually take the number of layers as a parameter and then have like 10 layers. But that is basically it. You guys have any questions?